Hi, it's Tamara. The supports available for victims and survivors of traumatic events are quite often deplorable. For as far back as I've been able to find, governments across Canada and the United States have underinvested in, or divested themselves from, services that are meant to make the most difficult days of someone's life a little less difficult. 4.5 years ago, I launched my company, Pickup Communications, as a way to fill what I saw as a glaring gap in these services, supporting victims and survivors who are forced to suffer on the public stage with the media. At the time, I couldn't find anyone doing this kind of work, not in Ontario, where I spent my career as a crime reporter, and really not around the world. If such a service was available, it was the exception and not the expectation. Needless to say, this journey has often felt like a lonely one. But over the past few years, either by me finding them or them finding me, I've met a handful of people around the world who share my goal of changing the system by which victims and survivors interact with and are impacted by the media, to the benefit, really, of all stakeholders. For the final episode of this season, I spoke with one of those people. Here's our conversation. Okay, so David, why don't you just start out by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm David Guarino. I'm the founder and president of a nonprofit called Survivors Say. And I also, in my day job, lead a communications firm in Boston, Massachusetts called Melwood Global. We have an office in Boston and Washington, D.C. And I'm a former journalist as well as a government communications spokesperson as well in my past lives.
I love this because your past lives very much inform your current lives, David.
For
I'm
sure.
just going to mention to the listeners and viewers that I initially reached out to you, I think a couple of years ago, David, because I think I saw a story published by the Pointer Institute about your nonprofit Survivors Say. And I was like, oh my gosh, so this guy's doing like everything that I'm like trying to do. We have to connect, we have to talk. And you and I have had a couple really great conversations since then. And this is no doubt going to be another one, but just tell our listeners, the consumers of this podcast, what is Survivors Say?
Sure. And it was so great to connect with you then and since, because, in this work, you just are so hungry to find other people who are doing the same thing and think the same way. So I was so grateful for that and am grateful for all the work you're doing in your book and the podcast. It's wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you for that.
So Survivors Say is a nonprofit organization. We're based in the States, but we can do work anywhere. We have volunteers mostly in the States at this point. We have a couple folks in Europe as well, but we are set up as a fully volunteer organization, and we provide communication services to survivors and families that are going through high-profile traumas. And how do we define that? In large extent, the media defines it for us. What is high profile is what the media turns its gaze to. A lot of times they end up being homicides, mass trauma events, weather-related events, traffic fatalities, you name it. And you've got these families and survivors who are going through the worst moments of their lives, and the media comes knocking on their door. And they are sometimes very well prepared to do that, and they have folks who advocate for them and support them, and we're thrilled to see that. But too often, they have no support network, and the government support that's there for them through victim witness advocates and others, through hospitals, through clergy, through any organization, really kind of doesn't cover this area and helping them navigate the media. And, the media we deeply respect. I'm a former reporter. The job they do is very important, but survivors going through this just, deep trauma need someone on their side who can advocate for them in these moments and work with them if they need some space from the media and need to not be taking phone calls or having the media knocking on their doors, all the way up to if they want to engage in the media and tell their story. And that's
Yeah.
the service we provide.
Yeah. And I would just add to what you said regarding the fact that, victim service providers, clergy, all these people that might surround survivors in the aftermath of a traumatic event, not only do they not fill this role. Not only are they not really media aware, as we try to
Yeah.
be trauma aware and trauma informed, but I heard from so many survivors, like when I was doing my research a few years ago, survivors from across Canada and the United States who said,
Yeah.
I wasn't even contacted by a victim services personnel or victim advocate until after the media had come and gone,
Right.
until after the funeral, or because quite often the media is knocking within hours. I mean, I've talked about on this podcast having the experience of actually notifying family members that their loved one was a victim in something, and that's an awful thing to do, but it just speaks to how quickly these things move. So David, you mentioned that you're a reporter. You also mentioned you're a government communications person, so you were a politics reporter. But before you were a politics reporter, you were a crime reporter. Tell me why, like, tell me a little bit about that time of your life and why you ended up leaving crime reporting.
Yeah. I think like a lot of reporters, I was a print reporter, which I know you were before TV as well. And I think a lot of reporters early in their career start that way. The crime beat is a relatively good one, I think, to give a junior reporter. It's very black and white. It's very nuts and bolts. You
Or
show
so it seems.
it seems at the time, right? And you're thrust into these situations where you then have to operate at a very high level. And I feel like in hindsight, I don't think I was fully equipped to do that. And so but I was drawn to it. I can't lie. It's exciting to be involved in these things. These are stories that affect communities, and they get a lot of attention, and we all grew up watching crime movies and crime shows, and you get sort of enticed by that, and so that drew me in as something. The human drama is really compelling,
Mhm.
and so that's what drew me to it. And I covered quite a few murders, quite a few murder cases, fatal fires, accidents, all mass events, mass trauma events, and it just became quite a bit for me. And I think
Mm.
the sort of aha moment I had was, I feel like I felt at the time like I was getting sort of too good at the rap that I would have when I would go up to speak to a survivor or knock on the door of a family member, and almost 9 times out of 10 they would let me in and talk to me, and it became kind of, wait, maybe I'm too, you never want to be too good at certain things, and I feel like I
Mm.
was too good at that. And then other opportunities came up as well. I felt like it was the best thing for me personally and professionally to try to go cover politics and government, but it was nice to be able to take a step back.
If you're comfortable doing so, David, I wonder if you might expand on that, the idea of being too good at getting
Mhm.
people to talk to you, because this is something I've talked about many times over the
Yeah.
last couple of years with various journalists and former journalists. The idea of, what makes a good journalist? Are you a good journalist because you convince somebody to talk, or are you a good journalist because you choose not to ask, because they've already indicated they don't want to talk? So
Right.
what do you mean by being too good at it? Like, do you remember how it would go at those doors? Why do you think that they would want to talk to you and maybe not the next reporter who came knocking on their door?
Yeah. I think it was I think I'd like to think it was that I showed empathy. I don't pretend to think that I was trauma informed. I was certainly, I think if you're a crime reporter, you're trauma aware because your whole life is around it, but especially at the time, it was less of a conversation, certainly in newsrooms. And so I think, but I still brought a level of empathy. I think most, you've said this on your podcast and your book, most journalists get into the business to because they want to, tell good stories, and they like to profile people, who are doing good things, and they don't seek to cause harm.
Yeah, they
And
want to make a positive impact in the world.
right, exactly. And so I think that that's what I showed when I would knock on the door, and I would say, I'd apologize first and say, and I would give them some agency in it and say, I'm writing a story, about what happened, and I'd love the chance to talk to you about your loved one. Typically, it was somebody who had passed away, and make sure that my story is more than just the last moments of their lives, but covers, some more a broader, breadth of it. And if you're not willing to speak with me, I understand. But if there are other people I can speak with on your behalf, or, neighbors, relatives, others, please let me know. And sometimes they'd toss me off the porch, and I'd be relieved if they did. But sometimes they would invite me in. And one of the last I remember, it was a drunk driving accident. It was one of the last real big crime stories I covered. And the family let me in. And I was kind of hoping they would toss me off the porch, as I said, but you can't go back to the newsroom unless you've tried. And they brought me in, and we spent about 2 hours going through family photos and the life stories. And he had, the friends of the young person who died were there. And, the story I wrote was much more about his life than about his death. And that's a longer term discussion I think we can have about how
Mm-hmm.
does it change the paradigm in crime reporting, but it did in that moment. And I was glad for that, but it also, leaving the porch and writing the story, I didn't love how I felt. I would go home, and even if I had felt I did well by the family by telling a more complete story, I felt like I was taking something from them, that it wasn't as much, um, conveying their wishes as pulling stuff from them.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't feel good after a while.
So I mean, you just answered the question I was going to ask, which was why you didn't feel good about it and why you wanted to be thrown off that porch. Because I guess in your heart of hearts, you felt like you were
Yeah.
exploiting these families in some way.
Yeah. I don't think I could have defined it that way at that age,
Mm-hmm.
and when I grew up in journalism, in you as well, and I think that it hasn't changed that much. It was kind of you need to be tough. You need to, you can't show your emotions. You need to be this, the code of ethics, such as it is that you have a detachment from it all. And, you don't get to have these stories affect you. But they do. And so,
Mm-hmm.
the the cleaner that, the less that effect could have on me, the better. And so if I could go back to the newsroom and say, sorry, the family's not talking, and just write it off the police reports or the detectives I interviewed, then that would have been fine. But it's just harder when it's both better and harder when they agree to let you in.
So, what would have been made it a more positive all around situation, do you think, for you? Because something I hear from journalists who do kind of push back on some of what I say, and
Yeah.
I will point out, and we've talked about this before, that most journalists are happy to have somebody like you or like me acting as the
Mhm.
liaison, that
Yeah.
person in between. But sometimes they'll say, people, lots of people I talk to, they want to talk. Like you said, 90% of the doors you knocked on the other side was somebody who invited you in.
Mm.
But what would have made it better for you if those people were inviting you into their home? What would have made you leave that front porch thinking, like, feeling good, like feeling like your cup was full instead of empty?
Uh, I don't know that there is anything for me. I think that the families do their best to, in my experience, to try to understand what I was doing and appreciate that, yes, what happened is newsworthy. But I think even if they make you, it's not their job certainly to make the reporters feel better, but even if they do make you feel better, you leave and sort of go home and reflect on it, and you say, in addition to the horrific trauma they received, that they had to live through and they have to deal with, then I was there asking these questions. So I don't know that there is, I think that can come later. I think that can come if the family, if you check back in with the family, or the family decides to turn their anguish into activism,
Mm,
and then they call you and you can do stories about that. Or if it's a homicide case, and they need some help promoting the search for whoever was the perpetrator, that's where the sort of reward comes in as
mm,
a journalist, where you feel good because you're not just writing about the incident, but you're
Mhm.
then helping them in their quest for justice or their quest for changing society in some positive way.
They're coming to you with a clear goal. I
Right,
want you to do a story because, and you're making that the focus of your story. It really
right.
feels a lot more even, like even a lot more level
Yeah.
playing field.
And this is your phrase, but I'll steal it, is you go from being a story taker to a storyteller,
Mm.
right?
Not my
It's
phrase.
not yours?
CBC journalist Duncan McHugh. I will sing his praises to the
It's
end of the
beautiful.
earth. Exactly. Be a storyteller, not a story taker.
Yeah, that covers it completely. And
Yes.
I think, as a journalist, I didn't feel like I called myself a storyteller, and many times I was, but in these moments, you feel very much like a story taker because the folks involved didn't have a choice until you showed up on their door.
Yes. Yeah. I wonder what advice you would give to your younger self then, David,
Mm,
if you could go back to that younger David, cub reporter
yeah.
who's just been sent out to do that door knock. What would you say to him?
I think that it would be, I think that it would be to be more empathetic and be more, to make sure that you really, um, sometimes when you give that speech at the door, you're not as articulate, you don't slow down as much, you kind of rush through it, and then suddenly you're asking questions. And so to be more deliberate about it and really try to slow down the conversation. Um, and I think, I don't know that this is possible, but I think if I could have pushed back on my editors more, to do some of the things that you talk about often, about how journalists can make sure that survivors are hearing their questions before they're asked, are seeing bits of the story or the entirety of the story. And I never once advocated on behalf of the people I was interviewing to my editors to say we
Mhm.
should do this. I just bought into the story that we can't do that as reporters. We can't
Mhm.
we can't share that material. That's ours until it's published, and then it's the world's. So I wish that I had, even as a younger reporter, certainly as a more veteran reporter, pushed back a little bit harder on
Mhm.
that.
We'll be right back.
It's just recently I got a phone call from a young woman who's a trauma survivor, and I was trying to support her because she wanted to go public with her story. And I connected her with a journalist, and unbeknownst to me, they got together and did an interview. Like she wanted me to connect her with this journalist, but I didn't know it was happening, so I wasn't there to support her or anything. And unfortunately, she called me the next day and said it was an awful experience, that this reporter had, on my advice, because I talked to the reporter ahead of time, sent her some questions ahead of time, but then very quickly went off script, was asking very inappropriate questions about the actual incident. And it was just not trauma informed, and
Mhm.
it's just it just puts a punctuation point on how very vulnerable trauma survivors are when they're talking to a reporter, and how far something like what you just said, sending questions over, can go. But as long as you're sticking to those, basically
Stick
to
to
those
them.
questions, and not taking them by surprise, and something like what you just said about maybe just slowing down, not just showing up and then launching into the interview. That was
Right.
another thing that the survivor said. Like, they got together, but it wasn't clearly communicated to the survivor
Mhm.
that this is going to be for the interview. Like, I think
Right.
we in the
Right.
media, David, often forget that most trauma survivors have never worked with anybody in the media before.
Yeah.
They don't know how it works. So when this reporter was saying, okay, come and we'll have a conversation, she didn't know she'd be sitting down at a table and there'd be a microphone put in front of her. And it was just a whirlwind. So there's so much value in what you just said, and that slowing down and really
Mhm.
making sure that they understand. Okay, I want to switch gears to your work with Survivors Say.
Sure.
You told us a bit about it at the beginning, what you guys do in supporting trauma survivors, quite often, like in the immediate aftermath of traumatic events. I wonder, in the course of your work, because how long has it been? Has it been what, 3 years you guys have been doing
3
this?
years 3 years officially. I think like a lot of people who work in communications and PR, we do it informally, before then. But when we finally got going, as a formal enterprise, it's about 3 years, yeah.
Okay, so informal work, formal work. And speaking of that informal work, I know you mentioned to me in a previous conversation that I think it was when you were working in government is when you really realized, because people would be contacting and looking for support. Can you tell me a little bit about, like, have you learned anything through your work, informal or formal, with survivors, say, that has surprised you about working with trauma survivors? Because it's one thing to say, as I did when I first launched my company, I'm going to go out and support trauma survivors. But then there were all sorts of things that kind of surprised me about, the things I didn't realize that I didn't know.
Yeah, I feel like I'm learning new things every day. So it's hard to know where to begin. There's just so the level of research that's coming on trauma and its impact on the brain and people's reactions to it is so informative. And I went to a conference, and someone from the FBI was speaking about mass trauma incidents, and she said, if you've worked on one mass trauma incident, you've worked on one mass trauma incident. And I think that that's true for the work that we do. There are obviously takeaways that you can and you get better with your lists and things to prepare for, but every single family, every single survivor is different, and they have different needs. And sometimes the media acts in different ways, and the story goes in unexpected ways. So as much as you think you have to be nimble and follow wherever the survivors and their families want to go. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. The other one is how receptive the media has been to our work. I didn't, you said that, but I didn't start there. When I started this work, I thought, oh gosh, the media they're gonna hate us. They're gonna think that we're a shield in between them and telling these stories. And one of the first sort of real cases we worked on was a mass trauma incident, and it was some of the survivors were from the area where I live, so in Massachusetts, and so I knew a bunch of the reporters. And the minute they realized that I was involved, they all said, "Oh, thank God. We don't want to go knock on that family's door. We love the fact that we can be more transactional with you. We can just say, hey, we need a photo. Hey, is there anybody going to be available before my 5 o'clock live shot, etc." Things you would never, good reporters would never want to bother the family with, they could bother me with.
Mhm.
And um, that was nice to hear. And we've seen it since then. Is now when people see us at crime scenes or court arraignments or things, they immediately come to us and say, "Oh, are you working with this family? Here's what I'm looking for." And it becomes much more comfortable for the reporters too, which I didn't expect. We've yet to have one moment where a reporter, sometimes they'll try to go around us, but where they've really, in an aggressive way, have gone around us and bothered the family after they've known we've been involved.
And then how do you handle that sort of situation?
When they go around us,
Mhm.
I mean, thankfully, at that point, the times that it's happened, we've already, the first thing we really focus on when we get connected with a family is building that relationship, and it's in that moment. And from your trauma research, anyone new coming in at that point, they're, the survivor is going to be very skeptical. So we try to be very deliberate in the front end to build that relationship, much more so than I ever did as a reporter or even government communications or in regular PR. You really have to make it a personal relationship as quickly as possible. So by the time that's happened, when reporters have gone around us or tried to, the family members usually very trusting, and they just shut it down and say, call David. And so that's we've been lucky that way. But we'll call the reporter and say, politely, hey, maybe you didn't know, but the family had asked us to triage media calls. What are you looking for? How can we help? And just move on. I mean, it does, from your reporting days, it does no good to be confrontational or yell at a reporter or try to
Yeah.
tell them how to do their job, but you can delicately say, the family asked us to do this. Please respect their wishes, and how can I help you?
Yeah, it's media training 101,
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
can I help you? Like, I'm not the person to talk to, but let me
Right.
put you in touch with somebody who is. I probably should have asked this earlier, David, but can you just take me back and tell me about how Survivors Say came along? Because I sort of alluded to a moment ago how,
Yeah.
there was stuff that happened when you were working in your previous roles with
Mhm.
government. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, and I was sort of surprised that there was even a need for this, to be honest.
Mm,
I people would come to us, or other people I knew who worked in PR, and would say, "Can you help us out? This family member has, gone through a tragedy, and can you help with the media?" And of course, it's like any other business, right? If you're a doctor, they call you with medical questions. If you're a
yes.
plumber, they call you with, right? So it's just natural, and you kind of get used to it. And one of the one of the folks that I worked with was Attorney General in Massachusetts, so it's sort of the top law enforcement officer. And I got to know the person at the state office of victim assistance, and we started talking about it. And at the Attorney General's urging, she said, you should really do this. You really have a passion for this. It seems like a way you can help people. And I talked to the person at the victim assistance office, and he did some research and said, I don't think there's anything like this in the, that I can find, or that anyone I know can find around at least in the States. And he said, I think the biggest problem you're going to find is you get too many phone calls, you get too
Mm,
many families that need you. And I said, well, that sounds like a good reason to start a nonprofit.
mhm,
And so that's what we did. And really, even before we were formalized, it was the mass trauma incident I spoke about before. It was a mass shooting where there was a family from Massachusetts that we worked with, and it was the first one we kind of did from the day of the incident
mm,
forward, and up to, through their arrival back in Massachusetts, where the media was interested in that, and the wake and the funeral, and then the memorial service, and anniversary since then, and whatnot. And they didn't want to do interviews, but in the first instance, but they wanted to do a statement from the family right around the
mm,
time of the memorial service. And we set it all up, and had them come into the police station, the local police station, to do the statement. And we had talked to the media in advance and said, they're going to read a statement. They're not interested in answering questions. They're going to come in, they'll stand here. Everybody gets it at once. If you want to do
mhm.
a live shot, here's where you can go. And it happened, and worked, flawlessly. And the police chief turned to me and he said, gosh, I've been doing this for 30 years and nothing's ever gone that smoothly.
Mm,
What's your secret? And I said, there's no secret. It's just we set expectations. Everyone knew what to
mhm.
expect. The
And
family
you know
knew.
the media.
If right, the family knew what they were going to do, the media knew what they were going to do, and the media, you could always have a reporter who decides to try to break ranks and go up to someone afterward, but they didn't. And it was just setting expectations and making sure everyone knew they weren't going to get beat, they weren't getting anything else. And so that really kicked it into high gear for me of we need to do this. It's a service, it's a gap in services, and I know enough folks who would volunteer to help, and so off we went.
How did you get put in touch with that family to begin with, David?
It was through law enforcement.
So that's a relationship that you had made saying, this is the
Mhm.
work that we're doing. You had
Yep.
gone and met with different stakeholders, and then they called you, or you called them after this happened
They
and said,
called.
this family's going to need support.
Yeah, they called me. They said this is, they knew that I was interested in doing more of this work and just getting the idea of the nonprofit ready. And then this happened, and within, I think it was an evening shooting. By the next morning, they were on the phone to me and said, this family needs your help. And it was not a direct connect to the family. It was kind of a family friend. And then, slowly we were able to connect with the family. But that's something, and that I think is important, is
Mm,
we we would never do cold outreach to a family in that moment.
mhm,
We watch the news nonstop. We're in the news every day. Every day I see moments where we could help, but we don't want to add to the burden or the trauma that family's facing if they don't need us. So we try to connect with trusted referral sources who can in that moment say, oh, this family needs some help with the media. We know who to call. And so that's what happened there.
So let's talk about that for a second, because you and I
Yeah.
have sort of tried to unpack this issue in our off-air calls before.
Yeah.
I feel the same way. I never will reach out to a trauma survivor who I know is in the media, whose case is being covered in the media, because I feel like they're going to feel like I'm trying to exploit them in some way. Do
Yeah.
you think, David, is this like a journalism complex from all of our years where we actually felt like we were really taking something from them? Because you're saying you don't want to bother them if they don't need this, but we know statistically speaking that most people do need this. So
Yeah.
some people who are listening who maybe aren't in any of these relevant fields might be thinking, well, if that happened to me, I'd want somebody calling me and telling me that that service was available. So just expand on
Yeah.
that. Where does that come from, do you think?
I think it is. I think it's trying to evolve from my former self and say, how would I want this to come to me if I were in their shoes? And I know enough from working on these cases and with these families that people come out of the woodwork and they want to help you, and you're not sure who they are or what they're doing, and it's just the ick factor,
Yes.
it would just feel icky, and so that's where we started. um if someone convinces me otherwise, I'm open to it, but it just doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
And I think I'd rather err on the side of not doing that, and then having someone say, these folks were knocking on my door, calling me, or, one of the things that your research has exposed that I think we all knew is that in that first 72 hours, I think, you call it, they're just, they're inundated with requests and folks who further their trauma. And so I'd rather miss an opportunity to help than even risk, a little bit of inflicting further trauma. And so that's why we spend a lot of time, and it feels like we need to spend a lot more time get into those trusted referral sources. We
Yes.
focus a lot on law enforcement because they're often the first ones involved. In many jurisdictions, they have victim witness advocates who are helping them. So our board, we have a former victim witness advocate on the board. We go to conferences, we do one-on-one meetings and try to get introductions. But beyond that, police departments, prosecutors' offices, hospitals and healthcare, ministers, community groups. We're just trying to get the word out. And 201, they're thrilled that we're here, and they say, give us your pamphlet, because when you're in that moment, the folks who come in leave you with stuff, and it's
Mm-hmm.
here's how to think about planning a funeral. Here's how to have a cleanup crew come to your house if that's what you need. All the things that you just can't even imagine until you're in that moment, and they'll include us in that. It's like, if you have trouble with the media, here's somebody we've worked with in the
Mm-hmm.
past, and we're not endorsing them, but you can give them a shout.
Mm-hmm.
And that just feels more comfortable because they know that person, they built the relationship with that person even in over an hour or two, and then we're coming in with a little bit more of a comfort level than if we were just cold calling.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be right back.
So you've had like an all around, you said, like positive reception from those various stakeholders, because I've had
Yeah.
positive, like, okay. So let's talk about that, because I'm just thinking like back to some of the conversations that I've had. There's some that have been great, and that's usually people who I know, like in
Yeah.
Toronto. If I'm speaking with like a homicide investigator that I've known for years, they
Yeah.
know my heart's
Right.
in the right place. But if I reach out to, the head of victim services at a police service where I don't have any reputation, I find that they can be a lot more guarded, and it actually leaves me feeling like icky. Like I'm thinking like, am I trying to sell them something? And again, our models are different because I haven't come around to creating a nonprofit. Some people have told me that I should.
Mm.
But I'm still looking for people ultimately to pay me for this work. I do a lot of it for free, but
Yep.
you are run by volunteers and you get funded through donations. Whereas I am telling victim service providers and nonprofits and police services, you should be paying for this and
Yeah.
properly supporting your clients with the
Yeah.
media. And maybe that's why maybe it's worse for me, but tell me about like that reception. Cause it's brutal reaching out, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, you feel like you're automatically going to be labeled as, somebody's trying to get some profit
To
off
take
somebody's trauma,
something.
which it so isn't.
Yeah, of course not. Of course not. And I hope we have time to talk about, why. I'm pretty sure you agree. It's like this should be something government is paying for. This should be a
Yes.
service that is no different than helping them understand the court system or, any other part of what they're facing. But to answer your question, I think I feel very much like when I was a new reporter, where if I can get in and build relationships, then the trust is developed and the calls come in.
Mm.
One of the prosecutors' offices that we started working with, it's been a very slow process, but probably over almost 3 years now, where I started with a meeting. I was referred in from a trusted someone who knew both of us
Mm-hmm.
and with the victim services office. And then it took, 2 or 3 meetings before they first contacted me on a story. And
Mm.
it was a moment where they were way over their heads and there was international media, hiding in the bushes and coming up to the family. And they said, "Oh my gosh, like our PIO can't, our press spokesperson can't deal with this. The victim witness advocate can't deal with this. We need help." And I had already been there, so they called me.
Amazing.
And then after that, it's become a little more regular. And
Yeah.
now, I would say, there are 30 cases where they could call, and maybe they call on two, but that's better than none, right? And
Of
so
course.
it's building for the long term. It's terrifying for me to think about. Okay, how do we then build that to scale? Nationally or internationally, because there's just not enough hours in the day to do that
Mm-hmm.
kind of work that needs to be done to build that trust. But when I sort of shook my head when you said, "Are they all receptive?" They're not. And at first I took it a little bit personally because I know my heart's in the right place, but they don't. And they're if you're a law enforcement, if you're a police homicide detective or a prosecutor, all your job is the case. Your
Mm-hmm.
job is, if there was a homicide, to try to bring someone to justice for that homicide. And from covering this that typically they see the media as a distraction. They're
Mm-hmm.
not a cause for help. Sometimes they'll come to us and say, "Well, can you help us put out this? Here's the information. We're looking for someone
Mm-hmm.
who fits this description," and then they're using us. But 9 times out of 10, they'd rather that we don't get involved at all.
Yeah.
We're a nuisance. And so into that steps someone like us, who has press experience, has journalism experience, and we want to be an advocate for the family. And their first response, a lot of times I've found, is we don't really want the family to have that level of support because they might come out and criticize the case. They might come out and
Mm.
criticize the police department. But over time, I think we've built relationships with enough offices where they realize that that's not what we do. If a
Mm.
family wants to say something, of course we support them in saying it, but we make sure in our conversations they know, well, here's the impact that it will have if you go out and criticize them, or if you don't, or if you say something or not.
Mm.
And it sort of slows things down and calms things down. And I think the detectives we've worked with and the prosecutors we've worked with have seen that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely one of those things that until they see it, they're probably going to be skeptical.
And isn't that interesting? Because by them having that concern, they're not being survivor centered in their
No.
approach. They're thinking about themselves, right? Um, but the irony is, like, I've seen this a couple of times with some trauma survivors that I've worked with, where I was put in touch with them via law enforcement. or like a third party working with law
Mhm.
enforcement. And that is where, when I first meet the family, they are pissed off about
Yeah.
the investigators, and
Yeah.
they don't tell us anything, and I don't ever hear from them, and then suddenly I get a call that I'm going to be put in touch with you. But then by the end of the interaction, they feel supported by the
Yeah.
police service, because I have made their life so much easier and
Right.
turned this whole media thing into a healing element rather than a harmful element.
Mhm.
And that sort of helps repair it. So, like, I never use that as a pitch. Maybe I've mentioned it to officers sort of in very informal ways, but it should really all come back to what's best for that survivor. And if you're worried about them criticizing you publicly, well, I feel like you've got other things to worry about, right? But
I
let's
think so. Yeah.
let's talk about what you just mentioned a moment ago, because I do want to get into it, and that is the role that victim service providers or government should play
Mhm.
in filling this gap. Because, like David, you've got a full-time job, you're a successful public relations person. I know you volunteer hundreds of hours of personal time, probably thousands of hours at this point, no doubt, to do your work with survivors. Say, the work that I do for survivors, by and large, is also pro bono. I am paid by
Yeah.
some organizations that support survivors, but I feel like you and I would agree that ideally there wouldn't be a need for us, because this
Yeah.
would just be part of the system. So what would that ideal world look like for you, David?
Yeah, I think you're completely right, and I think like anyone doing pro bono work or volunteer work, you wish that there would be some way that you weren't needed. Of course, there's you get fulfillment from it and you get gratification from it, but if there was some when I started this out, I furiously was Googling and asking everyone I knew that how could there not be an organization that does this? That it's just, and how can government not do it? It just didn't make sense to me. So if that day comes, if we're successful and we convince enough people that this should be a government service or, somehow else, supported, great. I'll go volunteer at the local food bank. I'll find another use for my time.
Mhm.
But I honestly don't have a lot of faith that that's going to happen. I think that, um, I think personally that government should do this. That government should have, training for victim services supporters who can help manage, can support families and manage in the media. A lot of the ways that prosecutors and police departments are set up here, it would be challenging, and
Mm.
I've seen moments where we talked about where it may not be in the interest of the prosecutor's office, no matter what level they worked in, to tell a family or to advise a family because their first instinct is going to be to defend the case. So I
Mm.
think it'd be kind of a separate third party of some kind that's funded by government or is related to another branch of government that is in just broad victim services, and they're not necessarily associated with the prosecutor, so they can independently advise the family on all aspects of being a survivor.
Mhm.
And this is just one of them. I think too often government sees communications work as frivolous, as promotional work, and
Mm.
that's our view of government, spokespeople, right? Is they're just there to promote the principal and promote the elected official.
Yeah.
Well, in organizations like this, they're not. They're there to be a support for the family. So I think that's the best way to do it. I don't have a lot of faith that they'll get there, because it's just not seen as as much as a needed service, which is shocking because the minute you start talking to government leaders about it, they say, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that is absolutely necessary and critical for families in that moment, not for a very long period of time typically, but
Mhm.
for an intense period of time until it passes."
What I find difficult when I'm having conversations with publicly funded agencies is selling them on that ROI. Like, any
Yeah,
business is always looking, what's the return on investment,
yeah,
And like when you're talking to law enforcement, it's like, well, if, they might say if we have more officers, then crime will come down. And look, and you can see on this graph that there's fewer homicides year over year or whatever, because we implemented this program. Or, having somebody in court, like a victim advocate, or where I spent most of my professional career in Ontario, they had the victim witness assistance program. Maybe you say, well, yes, we're providing a valuable service to victims and survivors, but we have somebody there that's going to ensure that they show up to court if they're a witness, and that they have somebody there that can support them if they are a survivor sitting in the body of the courtroom, so that the prosecutor doesn't need to take on that role. But when we come in there and we say, I'm going to tell you, you have a problem that you didn't realize that you had, and you need to spend money on something else, they're trying to justify, how do I take money out of something else and put it in that? Or quite often with victim services, for example, I've been told quite bluntly, like, we see major value in the work that you're doing, but we have such a shoestring budget.
Yeah.
And we're working, most of the survivors we work with are survivors of intimate partner violence, and they are not talking to the media.
Right.
So we can't justify spending it on the homicide survivors, which is just, it sounds awful, right? But I think it's probably a reflection of society and how we value helping each other, I guess, because there's not a lot of money that goes into helping victims and survivors overall. Would you agree?
Overall. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's why the work you're doing, the research you did, was so critical, because it brings to light the impact of this trauma of the media. And you're absolutely right to identify the ROI. And it's almost impossible to define, but you know it when you see it. And there's a lot of areas of government that I think are like that. So I think, those in charge, could certainly be appropriately called out on that, where, there are plenty of branches of government or things that government does where you're just helping people and you can't necessarily define it. And one of the stories I tell is that there was a police involved shooting, and we got involved because the county prosecutor was investigating the police department and to see whether it was a justified shooting or not. And she knew about our work, and we had talked previously, and I'd gone and done some presentations and talked to them about us. And she called me and said, I'm doing this investigation of the police department. The family of the person who was shot and killed by a police officer is going to need some support. Would you help them? And at my first, like, really? Like, that's not really your area. And she said, no, I want them, I can't tell you what we're going to find, but I want them to have a voice in whatever we come up with. Even if we find that the officers were justified in the shooting, I think they're going to be upset about it. But I want them to have a voice. And I thought, wow, how amazing is that? And turns out that she did. She, her investigation exonerated the officers, and the family was not pleased about it. And she offered them a spot at the lectern when she did her press conference announcing it.
Wow.
And said, if you want to come up and criticize my investigation, feel free. And
I love that. I can't imagine that ever happening, where just for the family to even be invited there.
Right. And the family, they were frustrated, and they expressed their concern, but I think in part because of that, they realized, well, it sort of is what it is now. And what they wanted was more support for training of police officers in mental health awareness. And so they used the moment to advocate for that. And they were upset, and they had some criticism, and they wished it had gone differently, but they said, we need more investment in resources for officers so that they can identify genuine mental health crises versus something else that's more aggressive before they take aim. And since then, they've done a few stories, and we've supported them with the media talking about legislation that would help that. And I think, okay, how would that have been different if that prosecutor hadn't said that? The family might not have ever felt heard, and might have merely focused their public comments on their anger and frustration at the officers being exonerated, and maybe there'd be a protest and a rally and all these things. but they might never have gotten to the point where they could advocate in a reasonable way. They
Mhm.
might have just held their anger. And it's just such a great example of how this can work if the folks in charge kind of get where we're headed.
Yes.
We'll be right back.
What's so beautiful about that story is that this prosecutor approached you before they even knew what they were going to find, because she knew that this family would need support. But if from a PR sense, like it's like you step back and it's like you could have said she was getting ahead of the
Yeah.
message, you know? And that's
Yeah.
like crisis communications 101, like get out ahead of it. But that's not even what she was doing, but it's what she ended up doing,
Right.
because that's exactly where my mind was going too. The story would have been, downtown, there's this news conference happening, but
Yep.
outside there's protesters, or in this home, the family's angry and they're wondering why they weren't given a voice. Or it makes sense on so many levels. But number one, is centering the needs of that survivor, regardless of what
Yeah.
their views may
Regardless of
be.
what they're going to say. And she
Yeah.
reminded them before they went out there, you say whatever you want to say.
Mhm.
And that takes some guts, because it could have gone either way. But I'm glad it worked out, for the family and for the prosecutor. You're absolutely right. You could have seen it as, she was trying to convince them not to be critical, but
Mhm.
they didn't feel that. I think if they were here, they would say, and they've said to me, we felt like we could say what we wanted. So it's a good model.
David, in all these conversations that I'm having in recording season 2, just as with season 1, there are so many lessons in these conversations and the people that I'm talking to within them. And I think that what you just said is such a valuable lesson for prosecutors, victim service providers, anybody that could potentially support trauma survivors in any way. I love that. And thank you for sharing it.
Of course.
Something else that we chatted about offline was, I was telling you about how in another episode, a crime reporter told me that the impact that local bloggers have had on her work. Like, for example, she pointed to a time that a local blogger published the name of a deceased person before it was officially released and against the family's wishes. And I know that you have some thoughts on so-called citizen journalism when it comes to
Yeah.
traumatic events. What can you share about that?
Yeah, it's a difficulty that I think we're facing more and more in this work that we're doing, as the news media shrinks, and corporate takeovers mean that there's fewer people in newsrooms that can do thoughtful work. People still want There's still a hunger for these stories, right? We see true crime podcasts are the most listened to out there. People, as we talked about in the beginning of the conversation, people um, like the sort of human drama that comes from these tragedies. They pay attention to it, and so the gap has been filled by citizen journalists. And as a former journalist, as somebody who works with journalists, I support it, in my soul. But they don't follow the rules that professional journalists follow. They don't feel like they have to. The ones that I've worked with feel oftentimes have reflected to me that the news media doesn't do enough and doesn't cover certain things, and plays by the rules because they're in the bag for the prosecutors or the police. So in the example you use, releasing a name, that's a standard thing with the media. They understand that the family needs to be notified before they identify someone who's been murdered in that case. They don't the local citizen bloggers don't follow those rules, and they say, no, we know who it is, so we're going to publish it. And they heard it from a beat cop on the scene, or they know it because it was in this house or something. um Similarly with things like suicide, the media, the news media tends to not publicize suicides. And um this isn't a thing that some of the local citizen bloggers, citizen journalists, feel like they have to follow those rules. And that makes it much harder to support families in these moments, to be their advocate, because one of the things that we can provide for them is a predictability, is like, here's how reporters are going to act. We don't know 100%, and somebody could do something that we don't predict, but we know the rules of the road, generally. And when you have folks who are journalists who don't follow the rules of the road, that just, makes it harder for family members, to not be surprised by something, to not be further traumatized by something, because they don't know it's coming, because we didn't think to advise them of that. And it's a challenge that we face, because you don't want to unnecessarily scare them, but by saying, well, there's this local blogger and he might do this, but you want to make sure they're informed. And so we try to err on the side of, just so you know, there's people out there who do these things, and we'll do our best, and we have their phone numbers, but they don't always follow the rules. So
Have you run into a situation, Dave, where there has been harm caused, or you've perhaps had to put out
yeah.
some extra fires because of that?
Yeah, there was one, and without going into all the details, it was one where, a local, citizen blogger published something, and we had already been, working for, days, sort of working with newsrooms to say, this isn't really news. This is a private thing. Please, respect the family. And one by one, they all said, no, you're right. We don't cover that sort of thing. And then, the family saw it on Facebook the next morning, because this citizen blogger heard it and covered it, and they called and said, why couldn't you stop this? And that's hard. You wish you could, and you don't have anything to say, but express your sorrow, that you weren't able to stop it. And you extract promises from the citizen journalist of, well, this will be it. We're just doing that one, but
The damage is done.
that one is done, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard. You try to prepare families for this, but if you have folks who aren't following any of the normal rules, and we could have a debate about whether the rules are really the rules, and certain journalists don't follow them anyway, but by and large,
Yeah.
they do. And families,
Especially when they're working with a trusted liaison.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I'm talking to you, Dave, and you're telling me that there's a statement coming. There's
yep,
no need for me to be going and knocking on that door.
right,
So I
right.
wonder, in that case, and again, not knowing the details, not wanting to be identifiable, I just wonder, did you get any pushback from any of the reporters that had told you, like, okay, we're gonna back off, and then they see this
Yeah,
citizen blogger go publish these details and they get
it
pissed
got
off?
close. Yeah, it got close with one of the TV networks in that city. That pushes the envelope anyway. It's sort of, every night their newscast leads with stories like this. And they said, I'm not sure. The reporter I talked to said, I'm not sure. I think we might have to use this because now it's out in the public domain, but let me talk to my editor. And I said, or producer, and I said, understood. And in every moment that we had in this, we said, you have the control. We don't. We're asking you on behalf of the family to not do this. You can confirm it on your own, which they had, but we're asking you not to, publicize this, because it's something you typically wouldn't do. And the family's asking you not to do it. And this reporter said, I don't know. I think we're going to have to do it, but, let me talk to my producer. And I said, just do me a favor. And if the producer says, yes, we have to do it, let me talk to them as well, because I promised the family I would go up as high as I could within
Nice.
your organization, and just let me try. And they called back about an hour later and said, nope, you're good. And I think that maybe they would have gotten there anyway, but I'd like to think that that last bit really helped, because the
Yes.
producer then heard, not only do you have to make this decision, but you're going to have to talk to this person,
Yeah.
and you have
Yeah.
to deal with it. And I think
They're like,
that,
I've got a show to put together. I don't have time.
yeah.
Let's just scrap it. I love that. I love
So
that.
that, it worked. It was, the family would tell you they didn't leave thrilled, they didn't leave happy, but it didn't compound the problem, which was,
Yeah. And it would have been a lot worse had you not already had those prior conversations and gotten those mainstream media outlets off. I wonder, Dave, this is a question that I usually ask folks on the podcast, one you've probably heard me ask. What does the term trauma-informed journalism or trauma-informed storytelling mean to you?
I'm gonna steal the line from our mutual colleague Louise Godbold, who was on your podcast, and I know has done some research and training. And she says that being a survivor of trauma is losing control and losing your power. And so um, flipping that on its head is what I think trauma informed storytelling and journalism is where you, as the storyteller or the journalist, are giving that power and that control back to the survivor as much as humanly possible, even if it means pushing the envelope in the rules of journalism. Of course, it means leading with empathy and leading with, understanding and being more deliberate, some of the things we talked about. But I think that's the most important part of it, is giving back some control and asking questions like, is it okay to talk? Is it okay? Where would you like to do the interview? Is this setup okay? Here's how you look on the camera. Is that okay with you? Here are the questions. And then all the way up to, I'll be glad to share my story with you
Mhm.
before it's published, and let you, come back to me. A bunch of those things, my former reporter self says, "Oh my gosh, that's never going to happen." But I think if you want to call yourself trauma informed, that's where it starts.
And I should point out for anybody who's just listening to the audio version of this that Dave, when you just said the rules of journalism and pushing back against the rules of journalism, you did air quotes, the rules of journalism, because a lot of that stuff,
Yeah.
there are some policies that will say,
Yeah.
no showing the story to a survivor ahead of time. But a
Yeah.
lot of what we do as journalists that is harmful is stuff we do because it's just the way it's always been done. And we really don't have a real justification for why we can't do a better job of handing some of that power over. So I thank you for that. Love that answer, and love Louise Godbold for all of her wisdom on
Yeah.
everything trauma. Is there anything that we haven't talked about, Dave, that you want to get out there? Anything else that you'd like to add or leave our listeners with?
I think just, thank you for your work. Thank you for, giving air to this important topic. And I hope through this, much like the Pointer story that brought us together originally, we can find others who are kindred spirits around the world, who can start to create a network of folks who are willing to help families here. And, I know you'll put some resources online if folks can contact us through the website, or you have
Yeah,
my
I was
email.
just going to say I'm going to have that in the show notes, but say it for
Uh,
us too. Anybody who
yeah.
wants to learn more about Survivor Say or donate to Survivor Say, support
Yeah.
this amazing work, where can they
Yes.
go, Dave?
Survivorsay.org is our website, and my cell phone and email are on there for the world to have.
Wow,
And
you're brave.
um, we it's more good than bad comes from it. And we would just love, folks who are interested in supporting us. Of course, this is a fully volunteer organization. We want to get to the point where we can have staff who do this full time,
Mhm.
who can be aware and react quickly and reach out to referral organizations with support right out of the gate. We're looking for volunteers all over the place who can be on call, people with communications experience who can get trained up and who can be sent out there, and referral entities, whether you're in law enforcement or healthcare or religious entities, any of them. We welcome, the chance to connect with you in advance, so that when tragedy strikes, which we know it will, unfortunately, there's that support possibly there for families if they need
Mhm.
it.
I love that. And I'll just point out that I had the recent honor of meeting some of your volunteers, about a dozen or so, and you have like a real split of, former journalists and PR professionals, and former journalists who are PR professionals. So all sorts of people coming from all walks of life. And I'll point out that probably a lot of those journalists felt the way that you and I did when we were on the trauma beat, and the way that many journalists who are listening to this podcast do in terms of why they do the things that they do and all of that. So there's a lot of shared ground. So David, thank you so much. Thank you for the work you do and for joining me on the podcast. This has been such a valuable conversation, I'm sure, for so many people who are listening to it. And so I appreciate it. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Right back at you. Thanks for all the support and help.